For 200 years, one family ran an operation more disciplined than most intelligence agencies manage in 20. No handlers. No exfiltration plan. Just a story every member had to believe, completely enough to die believing it. In 2012, a lab cracked it open by accident, and nobody had agreed on whether that was a rescue or a leak. The story they ran was 3 words long. We're Portuguese. Said by hundreds of people across 200 years, none of whom had ever set foot anywhere near Portugal. This wasn't a memory. It was a script. And like any covert operation, it only had to work as long as everyone agreed to deliver it the same way, every single time, to every census taker, every neighbor, every judge who asked. This is not the story of a mystery being solved. This is the story of an operation run for 2 centuries against the most dangerous apparatus a family could face. The legal machinery of race itself, built piece by piece to sort every human being inside its reach into exactly 2 categories. The family that ran it called themselves Melungeon. Nobody else's vocabulary even had room for that word, and that's where the trouble starts. Even the code name is contested. Some trace it to the French word for mixture. Others trace it to an Afro-Portuguese word, meaning shipmate, or companion. 200 years later, researchers still can't agree on what the operation called itself, only that outsiders turned the word into a slur first and a label second. A name that won't resolve cleanly is its own kind of cover. Nobody can subpoena a word nobody can define. Picture the cover terrain next, not scenery. Tradecraft. Southern Appalachia is a stack of parallel ridges and narrow hollows running northeast to southwest, the kind of ground where a single valley can hide a community from a main road less than 10 miles away, where mountain walls do the work a guard post would do anywhere else. Hancock and Hawkins counties in Tennessee. Lee County, Virginia, just across the line. This isn't where the operation started. It's where it relocated to, once the original cover got too thin to hold in open country. Back up to the start. Late 1600s, colonial Virginia. Inside a narrow window before the law had fully closed. Some African men in the colony weren't enslaved. They were indentured, working a fixed term, then free. Free men with property, with the right to marry. In that same window, some European women on the frontier married them. Under the law as it stood then, a child's status followed the mother. Free mother, free child. That's the founding cell of the operation. Free black fathers, free European mothers, children born with no legal mark against them. For now. Then the architecture changed. Through the 1660s and into the early 1700s, Virginia hardened its racial code on purpose. Free people of color lost the vote, lost the right to testify against a white man in court, lost the right to bear arms, to marry across a line that had just been drawn. The world these families had been born free into was being redrawn around them, retroactively, while they were still standing inside it. So the operation activated. They moved, not as refugees drifting outward, as an extraction. North Carolina first, recorded as Free Mulatto in the tax rolls, then the Yadkin Valley, then the New River Country. Each move, the same pattern repeating: intermarry with white neighbors, adopt English and Scots-Irish surnames, let appearance finish what paperwork no longer could. By 1790, families recorded as mulatto, one generation earlier, were recorded as white on the very same census line. That isn't assimilation. That's a cover identity, laundered successfully through 2 generations of fieldwork. By the early 1800s, the operation had a forward base, Newman's Ridge, Vardy Valley, and it needed a story durable enough to survive a courtroom. Portuguese worked. So did Turkish. So did shipwrecked Mediterranean sailors. None of it had to be true. It only had to outperform the alternative, because the alternative was losing everything. Here's how you'd eventually break a cover like this, if you had the tools for it. You wouldn't need a confession. You'd need 2 threads that can't lie under questioning. The paternal line carried only father to son, untouched by anything the mother contributed. And the maternal line carried only mother to daughter, just as clean. Run both, and you don't get a story anymore. You get a chain of custody. In 2012, researchers Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane ran exactly that test on the core Melungeon family lines and published it in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy. The paternal line traced to West and Central Africa. The maternal line traced to Northern and Central Europe. A third thread, the broader mixture inherited from every line at once, was tested too, but it dilutes fast and reads less precisely. It didn't need to be precise. The two clean lines had already confirmed what the operation spent 200 years making sure no one could prove. There was a third cover story running in parallel the whole time: Native American ancestry. It was safer to claim than African ancestry, and in a handful of family lines, including the Sizemore line, it was even genuinely present. But the direct paternal and maternal testing of the core families never found it as the dominant signal. It was real in places. It was never the foundation. Even the backup cover story wasn't fully fabricated, which is exactly what makes a backup cover story work. Every cover story the family had ever offered — Portuguese, Turkish, Phoenician refugees fleeing Carthage, survivors of the lost colony of Roanoke — collapses along the same axis at once. Not because each story gets individually disproven, because the chain of custody only points in one direction, and it was never toward the Mediterranean. This was never theoretical for the people living it. In 1834, Tennessee's new constitution stripped voting rights from free people of color overnight. A Melungeon man named Vardy Collins, who had fought in the War of 1812 and owned 300 acres on the ridge, lost that land in a dispute with a white neighbor because, once reclassified, he was no longer permitted to testify against a white man in his own defense. The operation had a cover story ready. The cover story could not stand up inside a Tennessee courtroom in 1834. That was the one failure mode it was always built to survive, and on that day, it didn't. In 1924, Virginia passed its Racial Integrity Act and sent investigators back through genealogical records nearly 2 centuries deep, hunting for exactly the ancestry this family had spent that entire time burying. The operation was still active a full 200 years after it began. It had to be. By then, it had also outgrown its original cell. Descendants carrying Melungeon ancestry now number in the hundreds of thousands, scattered across the South and beyond, most with no idea they were ever connected to an operation at all. That's not a failure of memory. That's the operation working as designed. A cover this complete doesn't just fool the watchers. It stops registering with the people running it. So in 2012, when laboratory work finally surfaced what 2 centuries of intermarriage, relocation, and rehearsed answers had buried, was that the operation finally failing? Or was it the one outcome nobody on the inside had ever actually planned for, succeeding so completely, for so long, that the descendants no longer registered they were still inside it, and handed over the evidence themselves, voluntarily, for a study they volunteered to join? Nobody asked the people who built that cover whether they wanted it broken. They are not here to answer. What's left is the file: free African fathers, free European mothers, a legal code that turned on its own citizens without warning, a family that read the terrain better than the government chasing them for 2 centuries, using nothing but a single rehearsed sentence. Whether that counts, in the end, as a rescue or a leak depends entirely on who you believe the operation was protecting: the people who ran it, or the truth they spent 200 years running from. Nobody planned for both to survive.